Welcome to the third episode of Missions Matter by Disco, a show about building and scaling culture in the age of digital transformation. I'm Jeremy Vandehey, co-founder of Disco. Disco is an app that helps companies celebrate, reinforce, and measure their values inside tools employees already use, like Slack and Microsoft Teams. We help customers create values-driven organizations, which lead to happier, more productive, and more autonomous employees. Today, I'm excited to chat with Evan Wittenberg. In addition to advising Disco, Evan's the Chief People Officer at Ancestry and formerly an executive at companies like Box, HP, and Google. He's here to chat with us about how HR has changed and where the function is headed.
Hi, Jeremy. How are you?
Hey, Evan.
So I'm Executive Vice President and Chief People Officer at Ancestry, which is a family history and consumer genomics company. And I've been there almost 2 years. Lead an awesome team of about 70 people and places professionals. So we don't call it HR, we call it people because that's better. And HR generally sucks. I was really excited to join Ancestry because I cared deeply about kind of our mission and purpose as a real mission and purpose-driven company. And basically the reason I joined is because in this time of increasing global xenophobia and provincialism, our company has a unique opportunity to remind everybody that we're all human, we're all connected, and that diversity matters. And that's the world I want my 3 kids to grow up in versus some other world.
That's awesome. And even just that, change in not calling it HR to people, that's something I'm fascinated with, is how the industry is evolving and kind of what you've seen across your background. Like what are some of the, like where we were versus where we are now and where you think we're headed?
Yeah. So, I used to, when I speak at conferences, when I started that work a couple of years ago, I used to say, hey, raise your hand if when I say human resources, good thoughts come to mind. And no hands went up. And then there was always like one guy in the back of the room who sheepishly raised his hands up. And I'm like, your mom was in HR, wasn't she? Yeah. So there's a reason that human resources has a bad reputation, generally speaking. And this is speaking of human resources 1.0, not 2.0 or people. One is it's not business focused, typically hasn't been business focused. So HR professionals often think of what are we supposed to do as HR versus what is the business trying to accomplish and how do we help support that? That's number one. Number two is typically not data driven or metrics focused. So most organizations in a company will get up quarterly or twice a year and show their dashboard and how they did against their goals, OKRs, whatever it is. And typically the HR function doesn't do that, right? And so I've tried in all my environments to do that, to put up a dashboard, whether it's internal mobility and how we're doing against that or something else. And then the third reason is, for whatever reason, HR grew up as a function whose main purpose seemed to be to say no to employees or stop them from doing something wrong. And so, we're the rules people, the ones who say no. And that's, I learned deeply when I was at Google, when you act like people are inherently bad and try to control their behavior, you might stop the less than 1% of people who might do something wrong if you weren't doing it from doing it. But you also shackle the other 99.x% of people who would do the right thing and need to be empowered and encouraged and feel valued to go do that. And so, we just have a very different approach, which is that people are inherently good. We know from a lot of social science research, in good environments, people are even better. And in bad environments, they sometimes show their bad side. So create the right environment, empower people to do the right thing. And, and then if they don't, then you handle it. So there's only, 2 reasons why somebody might get their expense report wrong. Either they don't know how to do it, so you teach them, which is awesome because everybody wants to grow and develop, or they're a bad person, so you fire them. Why spend a lot of time building up, ways to stop that in the first place? So that's my kind of general approach to why HR hasn't been as good as it could be, and why, semantics matter, renaming it people, which I wasn't the first to do. I think I was the first to call HR business partners people partners, though, since the function is called people. But really the focus on people and the focus on values, culture, and why environments really matter to help people be their best.
There's just an interesting, the perception of not being respected or feeling like they just were saying no to things when they're really in charge of understanding and enabling every company's biggest resource. So I feel like that data piece is a big part of it. And it was what I sensed was a lack of respect, or we're just now, the more customers we talk to, they're feeling more emboldened because we sell to people organizations at Disco. to give them ammunition, to give them data, to say like the programs I'm putting in place are actually, improving employee engagement, improving retention, which has probably the biggest impact on the business over any particular strategy that some executive somewhere can think of. I don't know if you agree with that, or if I'm just like reiterating what you're saying from a little bit of a different perspective.
Oh, I think that's right. I have yet to meet a business. I'm sure there's a business out there somewhere, but I've yet to meet one that would be fine if it had 50% turnover in their employee base a year, right? I mean, every business at the heart of it is a people-driven business, and that there are technologies that are important, and there's core ideas, and there's business models that are important, but it's people who, at the end of the day, get it done. And there aren't any jobs that are individual anymore. Even software engineers, coders, right? It used to be the sense of I'm an individual in a dark room just coding, and it doesn't matter what else is happening. Well, it's organizations and products are so complex now. The code has to work with everybody else's code. So the need for communication, collaboration, teamwork is increasingly important in every kind of job. And the need for a function that can help support that can bring a different perspective, that can help leaders, managers, employees kind of understand some of that stuff in a different way than they might have been trained in order to be better is vital.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how you said you have 70 folks on the people team?
About, I think we're just under
70-ish, yeah. How do you think about scaling and enabling that team to better serve, their business partners, I guess, or their organizations, or maybe even just how it's structured and the strategy that went into that structuring? Yeah,
so there's some essential functions, right, in any people team. And I also, as I said, own places at Ancestry, which I'd partnered with but not owned before. So that's facilities, workplace services, and real estate. But in any people and places team, there's some essential functions. There's attracting talent and placing talent, if you will, right? And that we call that org talent acquisition now instead of recruiting. Talent acquisition seems to be the new name. But I'm focusing that team not just on getting the best people in the world from the outside in, but also finding the best people within the company for whatever open role, because people need to feel like they have a chance to move and grow and develop, and not everybody necessarily wants to be, grow old in the job they're in today. They might want to try something different, ancillary, or they might want to move up in what they're currently doing. So that's the talent acquisition function. Another important function is paying people and giving them equity and giving them benefits and making sure they're taken care of. And that increasingly is called total rewards, which really means compensation and benefits, but the new name, typically total rewards. And that's super critical because when talent is scarce and vitally important, it's important to make sure that you're being competitive in how you pay people, both in cash for today so they can pay their bills and their mortgage and all that stuff, but also in terms of long-term incentives like equity, where they see themselves as owners in the company and they want to do more and even better on behalf of the whole. And then benefits. I mean, we unfortunately at Ancestry have had a number of employee deaths in the last year, which I haven't seen that much before. I think I saw one in 5 years when I was at Box, and we've had a couple. So we just put in kind of a employee legacy benefit, we called it, which is how do we take care of people's families and loved ones when they're no longer there, and being overly generous in the moments that really matter the most and hurt the most is really important. So that's total rewards. Then there's people partners, right? These are traditionally called HR business partners. They're embedded in the business. They're really counsel to the leaders of each of the functions and helping to both represent what the people function is trying to accomplish across the organization, but also bringing back from the different business units what their specific concerns are. Because we have to solve two things. We have to solve for a great overall company, but we also have to solve for each individual function that has very different needs and life cycles and problems and issues. We have to do both. It's not one or the other. And the thing you're always fighting against is silo organizations, where one part of an org solves something in one way and then another function solves it in a different way, and you end up having a very different looking organization and very different employee experiences. We have an international team that really focuses on the unique issues of our international organization as well. And then we have a talent development team. And this includes everything from traditional talent management, so succession planning, performance management, et cetera, to traditional learning and development or leadership and management development. And when I say traditional, it's what we do is not traditional. It's hopefully next generation, but those are the kind of functions that fall within that.
You said a lot in there that's really interesting, and I think although it's unfortunate to experience any death at any organization, I think the legacy benefit really hits home, especially with what Ancestry is all about in terms of, mapping these connections and building a legacy. So building a culture that really stands behind that, I think is really cool. I am curious, something you mentioned earlier about traditionally the old HR, I guess, is like used to saying no to things, and the new people organizations they want to enable employees. Where do you feel like that line is in terms of, you mentioned a battle is like trying to not have these siloed organizations while letting employees be somewhat autonomous in terms of how they work, maybe some of the tools that they use. And a big trend that we see is this like consumerization of enterprise. And like we're even doing a lot of times an employee will be the champion of disco that says, hey, this is a fun, cool thing that I want to try. How does that fit in with how you think about that balance between autonomy while also, getting everybody on the same page, both in terms of culture, but like tooling and processes?
Yeah. So look, our people have better ideas than we do, or than I do, or the executive team does, right? They're closer to the problem, they're closer to the customer, they're closer to the opportunity. And so we have to have good ways to get those good ideas and to empower them going and doing great things. At the same time, there are some things that an individual might decide that make sense to them with the issue and challenge in front of them that lacks the broader context of the holistic organization, if you will, and would have impact on the broader context. So just as an example, we just talked to my people team this morning about a remote worker policy that we finally codified. We've had it, but we finally wrote it down. And I wanted my team to understand it because they represent it to the rest of the company. And we have tax issues if we put employees in places where we don't currently have employees, and the state then might be able to come after us for our taxes on our consumer products. So we have to be thoughtful about that. It may be the right decision for an org, a hiring manager, or one of my recruiters to hire somebody great in some state we don't currently exist in, but the implication on the tax side might be up to $1 million hit on the business for now having to pay taxes to that state. So that's where the kind of secret sauce comes in. Is how do you balance doing the right thing for the individual and empowering them without tipping over the whole organization, in which case that individual doesn't really have a job anyway, right? So, and then when it comes to consumerization of IT, which I certainly know well from my time at Box, the fine line usually is on security. So somebody bringing something in could be fine and they don't think about it too much. But if it's not secure, it opens up other vulnerabilities to the company that can have much broader reaching impact. And so usually it's fine as long as, it hits all the security checkpoints, because if it doesn't and it starts letting either the enterprise's information out in the world or individuals' information within the company, then, that's going to be a non-starter at some point.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I wanted to ask about your relationship with the other executives. So like the IT organization, for example, we see more and more people executives pulling in at the right stage, like the CIOs, the COOs, to be true champions, or at least, bought in on obviously the technology that Disco runs on, but also because we're seeing these executives caring more and more about this stuff. So I'm curious, like how that relationship has changed, if at all, over the years, in terms of your seat at the executive table, and how you would suggest other executives work with other stakeholders in their day to day.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's changed, at least in my what am I at now, 7 or 8 years as chief people officer. But I guess I will say what's clear about change, any change process, is that helping people understand and bringing them along on the journey is usually better than just kind of starting in a place and expecting them to get there. So I tell new leaders that we bring in, meet your people where they are and understand that, and then help them get to where they need to be if they're not in the right place as an org or an individual. But don't just start with where they need to be and expect them to jump there, right? That's too much. And so I have had to learn over time, again, don't just do what HR thinks it should do in a vacuum, but bring people along. Here's a problem I'm seeing. Here are some options. What do you think? Here's my professional opinion. Here's what I think we should do, but there are trade-offs, right? And have that conversation so that you get general buy-in along the way. And then, at the end of it, if you pick a solution, whatever it is, people are 90% of the way there already, and you've taken their feedback, and it's just good. One of our values is be customer obsessed. That applies to our external customers of our products, but that also applies internally, like really understand our customers and their needs before we just go and roll out a solution. And we learned from our mistakes. We made some changes to our performance management process at year end. We added a 1 rating to our 3 ratings. We did some other things. And some people thought it was fine, but some people really didn't like it. And now we're going back and doing probably what we should have done beforehand, which is we're doing some design groups with employees, cross-functional, cross-level, et cetera, cross-location, about helping to understand from them what they think a performance management process should be or shouldn't be. And as a side benefit, they're learning along the way how complex this is. Because they're saying, oh, we should do this. Oh, really? What's the implication on this other thing? Oh, I hadn't thought of that, right? Because that's not their professional expertise, but they are the end user and the consumer of it. And so we really have to understand. So understanding is also a way of educating at the same time. And it's beautiful when that works.
Yeah, I think that's really great, because even the example you used earlier of like remote work, and like me as an employee, I might be just not understanding like, okay, why can't I just work from home, X days a week, or even if I live in a different state, like I'm still capable of doing my job. Like I wouldn't have even thought about the impact on the business, like those state taxes. So I think that's great. I also really love this concept of, it's kind of that lean startup model of, like doing these fast iterations and getting really close with your customers, in this case, the employees. I'm curious, do you find that you're able to, how do you think about piloting stuff like that, whether it's a process change or a technology change? Are there certain areas where it's like, this is just something that needs to be deployed to everybody? Or do you think it's moving more towards a model of, the people executives are actually more like product managers. They just have different stakeholders inside of the company?
That's a great question. Well, having never been a product manager, I can't say that exactly. But I will say that I think it's a balance, right? So there are good ideas that are going to nascently come up, and if they work for some reason, then you've kind of already proven it can work in your org, and those are probably worth pouring some water on and fertilizing and making more enterprise-wide if they work for one group and they solve some problem and we know they can work in our environment. At other times, there are things that an org might want to do that will be either divisive or so different or so silo making that you might want to counsel them out of doing that in that case, right? So I think it's a yes and. It depends on the case to case. But understanding, so how do we get from saying no, right, to saying something else, is really understanding we do root cause, right? Like, oh, you want to do this. That will get us in jail. But what problem are you trying to solve? And what problem are you trying, right? Like 5 whys or something like that. And to get down to what's the real issue? Oh, we can help you solve that in here's 3 ways you can solve that better, safer, cheaper, and, more legal than what you had planned. That is the kind of true consultative work that I think the people function can and needs to do. And it's similar. I equate it to, the legal team, a general counsel. There are general counsels who I've met who would just say, no, you can't do that. That doesn't typically work. The business is going to do what they need to do at some point. So the general counsels that I've known and worked with who say, well, let me tell you 3 ways we can do that in a better, safer way. Those are the ones who are highly successful because they help the business progress while keeping us out of trouble or risk or whatever the particular case is.
Cool. Yeah, and with a lot of that, call it more experimentation or more, working with stakeholders, you're either getting a lot of qualitative or quantitative feedback. And something you mentioned earlier is you now have the power to take slides and data to the other executives or to the board, whether it's monthly, quarterly, annually. Do you feel like we're just at the earliest days of getting access to data that's going to help you make decisions, or are we already past it where there's so much out there and there's a lot of noise? It's the challenge is actually sifting through that to get to the stuff that actually leads to results. Like, where do you think we are on that journey?
I think it depends on the part of the people world that you're in. I think we're at different scales across the spectrum. There's some areas where we have a ton of data and making sense of it is the challenge. And there are other areas where we're just not tooled to get the data we really need in order to make those decisions. So I don't think I can answer that in a blanket way, I guess. And from some of the work we've done together, having the tools that we use to accomplish other goals also produce meaningful data that have secondary and tertiary impact that can help us is really important. So with Disco, for example, the rewards tool is great, but the idea of having, if we can get a report of who's getting rewarded for what kind of values-based issues, that could be really useful when we're going to do our annual or quarterly or whatever company-wide awards. We don't have to go and do a survey and do a questioning, nomination process. We already have the data. We can pick from the 5 people who are getting the most kudos for Pioneer Relentlessly, which was another one of our values. We can just pick from one of those 5 rather than starting a whole new process. We have the data already and it's crowdsourced from our system. That's more valuable than something else. It's harder to game, et cetera. So I think there's lots of opportunities where we already have, a way to get the information, but it's not tooled in a way that actually makes it useful.
Got it. So changing gears a little bit, something from the startup's perspective, selling software to people executives, what are some of the things that you're seeing in terms of like general trends that you're really excited about when you think about solving, problems that you're dealing with every single day? Because it feels like the space has really heated up and there's just so much opportunity, so much, like there's big technology changes. Like what gets you excited, or what are some of the things, outside of Disco that you see that you're like, this is a great time to have people as my stakeholder?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, it is such an explosion, right? The innovation being brought to the people space right now is spectacular. It used to be a couple of large companies provided 1 or 2 solutions, and that was it, and you had to pick one of them. And now there's something in every possible area, including areas you never thought of. And that's good and bad, just to be clear. There's really good innovation coming out. From where I sit, it's also tricky because you don't want to have 100 solutions to different niche point problems necessarily. It just adds so much complexity. And I'll give you an example. So from outside of the Disco context. So I was at Box. We had Workday. It had already been put in place when I got there. And I started having my benefits team came to me and said, we want to use this other benefits product instead because Workday doesn't really do what we need it to do. And then the payroll team came to me and said, we want to use this other payroll product because Workday. And everybody wanted to use best-in-class solutions kind of on top of Workday. And I finally said, time out. Workday's too expensive just to be a source of record, right? You can't do that. It has to do some of these other things or it's not worth it. And when I looked into it, I found out we just hadn't spent the time tooling it so that those other things were done at a high enough level of quality. So we doubled down and spent more time doing that. And I said, once we get Workday humming the way it's supposed to, if it still doesn't meet any of these needs, let's have that discussion, but let's not just put a bunch of stuff on top of it, right? Because it grows the cost basis. It makes a very expensive kind of HRIS platform not do what it's supposed to do. But it also just adds massive complexity because then you have to have integrations with all those systems. Employees don't understand where they're supposed to go for what. So I think it's a yes and, right? We want these innovative solutions. We need to be able to see what makes sense in what particular areas. But at the same time, we need to manage complexity for our internal customers, our employees, so that they have a clear and consistent view of what they're supposed to do when and how, or else they're just going to come ask my team, and my team doesn't have the bandwidth to do that, right? I'd have to hire a bunch more people just to take all the questions. It needs to be clear, consistent, and kind of obvious where they go for what, after some education, of course. And so some of the products that I've enjoyed, and some of these I've become advisors of because I've enjoyed, just to be clear, but ones that take manual work off my team's plate are kind of cool. So there's a company called EmpInfo, and they do essentially checks for loans and things like that. Whereas in the past, my team would get a call or an employee pop by and say, hey, can you print me a letter that I work here and how much I make because I'm trying to get a loan? This automates it all, right? Integrated with Workday, I pay a one-time setup fee, and then the banks pay them, and I don't have to worry about it. And at some level of a company's life cycle, that makes sense. I did a calculation when I was at Box, and I was spending like 10 hours of my team's time doing those kind of things per week. I said, that's a full day of somebody's time. That would be better spent. Let's do the little bit of work to get this set up, and it takes it off our plate, right? So that's an example of something that it just automates a manual task and takes the elbow grease out of it, which I like.
That's great. And you brought up another interesting point of, so in the realities of the day-to-day, you already have systems in place, especially like big systems of records that they have a ton of functionality built in, whether it's Workday or SuccessFactors or PeopleSoft. One thing we see with them is like they want to work with startups too, right? So I think they feel that pull of like people want to both maximize their existing investment in these systems, could probably do a better job of going deeper on like what do these platforms all support and are we really utilizing it to its fullest. But also selfishly, like we're glad that some people want best in breed, but realize that it needs to play well with these platforms. So I'm curious what you think the big companies are doing, or how you've seen that thought process evolve, both at like with working with those big companies, but also inside of companies like Box or Ancestry.
Yeah, I think it's dynamic, right? How big the need is and how painful it is versus how easy it is to solve with another solution and how expensive that is, I think are the general axes of decision, right? So if something's really broken and not working, let's say recognition, maybe some of your big old school players, it's just they don't get the pace and the tools that employees are on and how they do things. Like if it's important and it's broken and it's easy to fix and not too expensive to fix, that's going to be kind of a no-brainer. The less important it is, or the more pervasive and the more entrenched solution is in place, the harder it's going to be to make that change. And I think that depends on the system and the company and how open they are. I could equate some of this stuff to tech debt, right? Any technology company gets to a point where they just need to slow down and address the tech debt, or they won't be able to get on the next growth curve. That's always a terribly painful moment. I've done that in a couple of companies now. It sucks, but it's necessary. And frankly, you could say, well, you should have been addressing it all the time. The truth is they might not have gone so fast to get to that point if they had been working on it all along. So you just get to that point, and then you have to address it. So similar, companies use HRISs that probably don't scale that well. I won't name them because I'm not experienced with them, but some that are good for a 400, 200 person company, but they're not good for a 2,000 person company. At some point, they have to stop and say, okay, time out. We're going to have to take the pain now to build the platform that we can then build the growth on. So those are just point in time considerations. My team right now is putting in an integration between a new ATS, a new kind of candidate CRM, and Workday. And we haven't had it. It's been elbow grease. It's been carrier pigeons. It's been Excel spreadsheets, right, that we've been using. And this is the time when we take that pain and do that, because it's going to take manual processes out. It's going to make us more accurate, and it's going to move us faster so we can continue to grow. But it's painful in the moment.
And how far out are you, thinking or planning about? I'd imagine you're partnering a lot with each of the businesses. Is like the number of people the key driver, or like what changes your strategy the most when you're thinking like, okay, how do we get ahead of this in terms of tech debt and plan for this type of a migration 2 years from now? So it's not all just coming at you all at once. Like how do you think about that?
Well, there's a couple of pieces. So one is G&A as a percent of overall revenue should be going down as you scale, right, over time. So there's just that my internal thing of like, I can't keep growing my team as much as I have to this point, because we should be getting more efficient over time. So that's just one. As a professional, I have to make sure I keep getting efficient, smarter, faster, higher quality. Two is, yes, headcount growth. Where is it? How fast is it? What areas is it in? But if we're really going to be business focused, three or one, depending on how you turn it on your head, is really, what are we trying to accomplish as a business, right? We're launching a couple new product areas this year. What's the talent we need to do that we don't currently have? What are the ways that talent works that maybe we don't currently work? What is there, are we increasing our speed of development, which we have done over the last year and a half or 2 years? We used to roll out products every, year or two, and now we roll out products every 2 weeks, right? So that requires a new set of tooling as well. So it really should depend on what the business is trying to accomplish, and then what's the people part of that? Either new skills, new abilities, new locations. So that's another factor, or just growth in headcount. And then the third, if I flip it on its head, is how efficient as a org leader and a leader of the company, how efficient do I know I want to keep getting higher quality, better, faster, smarter over time?
Yeah, that's interesting. And you tying efficiency to something that you said earlier is selfishly interesting to me. If you mentioned that company that really streamlines the loan process or the paycheck approval. Oh, sorry, what were they called?
It's employment verification.
Employment verification. Was like, that's such a clear measurement of ROI. Like you can estimate, okay, 10 hours. Like if I'm paying less than what I think somebody's 10 hours of time is worth, then that's a home run. It gets a lot harder to do that in many other functions of people software. So I'm just curious how you think about that, or like when you're considering making a new investment in something, like it's something you want to do, but it might not, really pay off for like a year or 2 years. Like how do you weigh that against things that, need to happen now? And how do you work with other stakeholders who might be pushing you for like an ROI, or are they not? Do they understand the objective importance of some of this stuff?
I'd say, I get less ROI kind of conversations than I used to have, to be honest. And I don't know if that's because I've become skilled enough to sell the benefits of something without, and people assume I've done the ROI calculation or what. So to be honest, I don't know what's changed there, if it's me or them or the environment. But look, we had at Google this idea of 70, 20, 10, right? 70% of the stuff you're doing is core to the business, immediate payoff, like vitally important. 20% are like, projects that might pay off in the nearer term, but you're not really sure if they're going to work. And 10% are like moonshots. You have no idea if they're ever going to be anything, but it's probably worth putting in some time and effort there. Because if you don't spend some time on the 20 and 10% projects, you're never going to have that next innovation, that next growth curve, that next big thing, right? And you have to do both. You have to run the business and do what you need to do, but you also have to have some irons in other fires. And I think it's no different with this, right? There are some things that I just have to do that would fill up 110% of time, but I'll do that and I'll figure out how to get that done and leave some bandwidth for the stuff that may pay off long term. And some of those are, really gut calls. Like, do I think this is going to solve somebody's problem in an innovative way that will help the business in the long term or not? Some of that is being customer obsessed, right? Is somebody bringing this to me and saying, this is really awesome, we should all use this? And is that enough people that there's a there that I can find out what's the negative goodness in there and try to scale it? And, with something that the company's already doing and spending money on, the ROI is a different discussion, right? If we're already doing and spending money on it, rewards programs would be an example as the disco analogy, then the change is not a net new spend. It's a change from what we're currently doing. And is that change get us to where we need to be or not?
Got it. So you mentioned location as a you called that out specifically. Where is most of Ancestry based? And I'd imagine you have a few offices. I probably should know this ahead of time, but
it's fine. How
do you think about the distribution of work and where work is headed in terms of connectivity, collaboration, and building that unified sense of this is what it feels like to work at Ancestry? And in conjunction with that, you also mentioned places as like a new role that you're taking on. And we've seen the importance of the employees, not just their physical experience, but what it means to go to work every day, where they work, and the importance that has on their experience. So I'm just curious how you think about all of that and the changes that we've seen and where you think it's headed.
Yeah, it's vitally important, right? The spaces people do their work in, the way they're enabled, empowered, refreshed, et cetera, matters a lot. So we have our headquarters is in Lehi, Utah. We also have an office in San Francisco. We have kind of our senior executives spread across those two offices. We have our professional genealogists are in Salt Lake City. So those are our main U.S. locations. International headquarters is in Dublin, We also have an office in London, and we have a small office in Germany, small office in Australia. So that's kind of currently where our offices, quote unquote, are. In terms of the physical space, I've said this in other venues, but I think it's worth repeating, which is I've worked at companies where you could be anywhere in the world at one of their offices and you wouldn't know what company you were at because they were all so different. That's one extreme. I've also worked at companies where you could be anywhere in the world. You wouldn't know where in the world you were because they were also the same, right? So that's the other extreme. So from cookie cutter to highly customized, like I think either of those extremes is wrong. I think you should feel like you're at Ancestry no matter where you are in the world, but it better feel like Ancestry Dublin as well, because that's the way that you engage the hearts and minds of the local employees, which is the whole reason you're there in the first place. So it has to be both. It has to be the company and the location, pride in both, some distinctiveness, but some shared commonality. So maybe it's 80-20, another 80-20 principle. But and that's what keeps people engaged. We feel part of a whole. We're connected, even if we're physically separated, but we have our own local pride and flavor as well that fits within that.
Yeah, and I think subcultures is an interesting dynamic of how do you, is there like there's core tenets of what you're looking for in terms of can they do the job and can they, I guess, contribute to the culture? But then there's all of these other dynamics that are somewhat localized. So I'm curious, like, how you think about fostering those while unifying people around, the core of what it means to work at Ancestry.
Yeah, when you scale, if you're all in one office in one room, culture is determined just by the behaviors that people do, right? And everybody learns that through osmosis. Once you scale and you're in different offices, then that's when you need to have some values and some behaviors tied to those values so that everybody knows what's expected, what's rewarded around here, what's not. Because at the end of the day, culture is just a set of the behaviors that people are doing, right? Because you can't see it otherwise. And so, having those shared values, making sure you hire against them, you promote against them, all those things, is what allows you to do that. Because then within the company values, people can make their own local flavor of what that looks like. Our Dublin team has a fun club. They do all kinds of stuff. They go play soccer, they go drinking, they do all kinds of stuff. The San Francisco team has a different approach. It's not a fun club. The Lehigh group has a different approach. They don't do the same exact things, but as long as some of the same collaboration and communication is happening, that's fine, right? As long as it's working. And then you have to tweak in some areas. Maybe it's not working. Maybe we should import what Dublin's doing into Utah because, that's working well, and getting everybody out and running around and getting sweaty once a week is a good thing for culture, right? So.
And have you hit that point where, like, even as a really small company, we're split across 2 offices, it feels very possible to, like, have a subculture down even in LA and then one in San Francisco, even though we're probably, much more connected than a company spread across continents, or at least similar in terms of what how different the subcultures are. But it still does feel different, or like the need to all be in the same room occasionally. It just feels like we're resetting our relationship in a good way. And it's like, okay, we're reorienting ourselves across the mission, the purpose, like why we're all here. Do you agree that with like the need to connect face to face, or do you feel like technology is progressing enough where we can all exist across the world and build meaningful, relationships with our coworkers, even though we're never truly even in the same room? And how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think technology has outpaced the development of the human animal by a couple 100,000 years. So, look, people still build trust face to face. That's how we're built, right? Everything from feeling other people out, seeing their micro expressions, shaking their hands, or whatever those different customs are. That's how people build trust. You can leverage technology once you have trust, but you got to build the trust first. And everybody's experienced that thing where they've done a VC with somebody they don't know, or a phone call with somebody they don't know. It's kind of awkward. And then you've had the experience where then you have lunch with that person, and the next time you do the VC, it's totally different, right? You just feel a different sense of comfort and connection.
Yeah.
At Box, we used to fly every employee from around the world to headquarters for orientation for a week.
Wow.
That's a big expense, but we thought it was important enough to be worth it because culture was so important and people should come to, the mothership and then, move outward. But it was also for building that trust, seeing people face to face, making that connection early on. Other companies have, other ways that they do that. I think if you have strong shared values, like at Ancestry, we have a 2-day orientation and we do several sessions by video between our 2 US locations where people are onboarding in both. So they have that shared experience, even though they're not physically together. And then, it's important to have offsites. So 1 or 2 a year where you bring everybody together in person, face to face for business and social reasons to kind of keep that or build it is vitally important. I do not believe you can just leverage technology. There's always something missing there. On the other point you made, the human animal is used to kind of in-group, out-group behavior, right? You identify with one group at opposition to another group, and that can be fluid and changing. And it's important to keep reminding people and redirecting them that the big group, in our case is Ancestry. My last boss used to say, we play for the name on the front of the jersey, not the name on the back, right? So it's Ancestry first, and then in my case, Wittenberg second, or People and Places second, or whatever it is. Just reminding people about what the primary connection is, and then they tend to see the secondary ones, right? You tend to be more connected to the people you sit next to, just because of human animals, than the people, in another city.
Yeah, my old football coach wouldn't even let us put our names on the back of the jersey.
And my baseball team, the Yankees, doesn't have the names on the back of the jersey. Same thing.
That's right. You're a Yankees fan?
I mean,
you're
grew
from
up in
New York.
Yep.
You gotta be.
The Giants, my adopted baseball team, also doesn't have names on the jerseys, interestingly enough.
Something about
team.
Winning World Series. Is that the plural of World Series?
Probably not. World Series is? No, probably not. But it's good.
Do you think about, how do you share those subcultures with, does that happen organically through whether it's the day-to-day interactions or when everybody does get together, or is there some version of, hey, I've never been to the Dublin office, I'm interested in, seeing what it's like. Do you is that encouraged, or?
Yeah, I think, you can do everything from videos from different offices at town hall meetings, which I've seen we use that quite well at Box. The Japan team always seemed to win the funniest video because they were hilarious. You could do that just as a way both of reminding everybody that there's other people there, but giving them some flavor of what it's like to be there. But I think largely that is the team's own kind of thing, right? It's not that it shouldn't be shared. It's just not the main point to share it. It's just how they organize and kind of identify. What you really need to focus on is what does it mean to be at this organization overall, and what are the shared values and connection points there.
Got it.
There are a couple of core truths about what people who work in organizational life need, right? They need to feel valued. They need to feel a sense of belonging and connection, and they need to believe that they can have an impact and be successful. Those are kind of core, Maslow's hierarchy, core needs. They need to get paid. They need a seat to sit in, all that stuff too. But those are the kind of core needs. And too often in organizational life, we're moving fast. We forget to thank and celebrate people, right? Therefore not making them feel valued. Or we have a culture that's not inclusive enough to make them feel a sense of belonging and connection. Or the truth is some people can have an impact and some can't for a variety of reasons. And, we at Ancestry are working really hard to make sure that everybody gets those 3 core things: sense that they're valued, sense of belonging and connection, and belief they can have an impact and be rewarded for it. So one of the things that helps people feel valued is not just when their managers and leaders recognize them, but also when their peers recognize them. And so mechanism, we have something we call History Makers at Ancestry, which is kind of our white labeled tool that does recognition. And more important than whatever it is, I don't know, $5 gift card that you get from getting a recognition, it's posted on all the monitors throughout the whole company.
Cool.
In every location. When somebody gets a History Makers Award, they're tied to our values, to our 3 values. So you have to give them in one of those 3 categories. And that's what people love more than anything else, is the recognition. And it's not even for themselves. They love reading other people's recognition that they've received and to celebrate them. It does make, because it's kind of like giving a gift. It makes the other person feel good, but it almost makes you feel more good than the other person receiving it, right? Giving of it or giving of service makes you feel better than receiving of it. And so that's a really important part to making sure people feel connected, that you get that collaboration that for us is one of the most important things that we do, and that you give people a sense of, because that achieves all three, right? Sense of value, sense of belonging and connection, and the belief you've had an impact.
That's really cool. One thing that we find, and you mentioned this earlier as well, is the importance of trust. And like, that's kind of almost like a precursor to any of this. Like, if I don't feel safe that I'm in a space where I can put my political capital at risk and like say, hey, Evan, I think you did a great job, especially if I know it's going to be deployed to all these TV screens, trust becomes even more important. So I'm curious how you think about fostering that, especially as more and more people are remote and like your perception of, distributed is an avatar or a bunch of messages or whatever you use to communicate. So how do you think about that?
Yeah. So as I said, trust is built kind of face to face. So you have to, it's built at the company level by doing what you say you're going to do repeatedly and never violating that. Right. And so the do-say ratio or the say-do ratio has got to be very, very close. Yeah. And following through on commitments, taking accountability, taking responsibility as a leader, even if you didn't specifically do the thing. Like, it's when our company messes up, it's on me. I'm one of the 7 people who runs the company. Like that, I got to take full responsibility for that. And I can't just say, oh, I didn't know about that. It's like, maybe I should have, right? So that's kind of what builds trust at a company level. I haven't seen people not feeling trusted to recognize and reward others. I have seen the reverse, which is it's very hard for people to give developmental feedback to others. Mm-hmm. And I actually said in front of our company like a year ago at one of the all hands, is like, if you really cared about each other, you would want to give each other feedback to get better, right? So we have a little bit of being, too nice, which other companies I've worked at have as well, right? Like, you want to preserve the relationship, so you're nice, but what you're doing instead is not giving somebody the opportunity to get better based on feedback, given in the right way, right? Not thrown in their face or given as an insult, but feedback given in the right way helps people get better. And if we really cared about each other, we would help each other get better. Yeah. Kind of like in a family.
Yeah, and I know you know this, but our listeners might not. We used to do constructive feedback inside of Disco, and we kind of opened up a can of worms that we weren't ready for. Yeah. I think we definitely still have aspirations to help people improve. And there's a lot of philosophy between like, should you try and cover all your flanks or just like really sharpen your strengths? I think it's, like you said, it's never one end of the spectrum or the other. It's a little bit of both. And I think that's even more important is trust. Is like, do I feel safe that Evan and I have this relationship where like I can actually tell him something I think he should improve upon, whether that's something the manager knows or doesn't.
Yeah, and the precursor to trust or the substitute for trust is assume good intent, right? And in most companies I've worked at, like that's just a piece of it. Like, assume that other person has the right intent in mind. That person you never met on the other side of the world is solving a problem in the way they best see fit, right? Like, let's assume good intent. When it comes to developmental feedback, you don't have to do something based on somebody's feedback. But what I like to say is you have to hear it. So how do you develop an open mind so that you can at least listen to it? And then you can decide, am I going to do something about it? So there's nothing wrong with giving or receiving the feedback. You can then decide, hey, I'm going to focus on my strengths and not fix that thing. That's fine, right? That's your choice at that point. But if you don't hear it, or you're defensive, or nobody ever says it because they're worried, you never get to that point of being intentional about what you're going to do with the feedback you receive. And that's the really important point, intentionality. So, yep, I heard you don't like, my voice on the radio. Well, you know what? I could work long and hard to fix that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to spend more time on these other things that I think is more important. But, thanks for sharing. And then there are, obviously in feedback, there can be some things that are just derailers or blockers for me that will stop me from being successful. Hey, I noticed you tend to pick your nose in the middle of executive presentations. You might want to think about not doing that. Yeah, good point. That could really stop me from being successful. Why don't I try to do something about that?
For the record, I would never say you don't have a good radio voice.
Thank you very much. Yours is beautiful as well.
Thanks. This podcast is a production of Disco. We recorded it in the world-class Donatello Studios in San Francisco, California. I want to thank Evan, our guest, for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the time.
And if you have any questions, comments, suggestions for future episodes, just send me an email, jeremy@justdisco.com. On behalf of Justin Vandehey, Joseph Estrada, myself, and the entire Disco team, thanks for listening.